The Arizona dust swirled like angry spirits around Margaret Maggie Thornfield's polished black boots as she stepped down from her carriage onto the main street of Copper Creek. The year was 1889, and the frontier town buzzed with the kind of desperate energy that came from silver strikes and broken dreams. Maggie's emerald silk dress, imported from San Francisco, marked her as clearly as a brand. She was money, power, respectability in a place where all three were as rare as water in the desert. She'd come to town for supplies and to collect the monthly rent from the property she owned along Main Street. The Thornfield Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, making her the wealthiest woman in 3 counties. At 32, she'd been widowed for 2 years, and the black mourning dress she still wore served as both armor and advertisement, untouchable, unreachable, and utterly alone by choice. "Mrs. Thornfield," called out Samuel Jenkins, the bank president, hurrying across the street with his hat in his hands. "Wonderful to see you in town. I trust the ranch is prospering?" "As well as can be expected, Mr. Jenkins." Maggie's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'll need to review the quarterly reports this afternoon." Of course. Though I should mention there's been some unpleasantness near the Mercantile Street, children, you understand. Perhaps you'd prefer to conduct business at the bank?" Maggie's jaw tightened. The unpleasantness Jenkins referred to was the growing population of orphaned and abandoned children who lived in the alleys and abandoned buildings of Copper Creek. The silver boom had drawn desperate families from across the country, and when the mines played out or accidents claimed breadwinners, children were often left to fend for themselves. "I'm perfectly capable of handling whatever riffraff might be lurking about, Mr. Jenkins." As if summoned by her words, a small figure darted between the legs of passing horses and collided directly with Maggie's skirts. The impact sent her reticule flying, its contents scattering across the dusty street like seeds on barren ground. "Watch where you're going, you little—" Maggie's sharp rebuke died in her throat as she looked down at her assailant. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 years old, all knees and elbows and enormous brown eyes that seemed too old for his dirt-streaked face. His clothes were little more than rags held together by hope and stubbornness, and his bare feet were tough as leather from months of navigating the harsh streets. But it was his hair that stopped Maggie cold, thick, dark auburn curls that caught the sunlight like burnished copper. Hair exactly like her late husband's. "Sorry, lady," the boy mumbled, scrambling to collect her scattered belongings. His small hands moved with practiced efficiency, gathering coins and papers with the speed of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant hunger. "Didn't mean to bump into ya. Get away from my things." Maggie snapped, her composure cracking like ice in spring. She snatched her reticule from his hands, noting absently how his fingers were stained with ink and his nails bitten to the quick. "Don't you have somewhere else to be? Some gutter to crawl back to?" The boy's face flushed red beneath the grime, but he stood his ground with a dignity that would have been admirable if Maggie had been in any mood to admire it. "I ain't done nothing wrong, lady. Just trying to get by, same as everyone else." "Getting by?" Maggie's voice rose, drawing stares from passers-by. "You mean stealing, begging, making decent people uncomfortable with your very presence? Street children aren't my problem, boy. They're a blight on this town, and if I had my way—" "Mrs. Thornfield," Jenkins interrupted nervously, "perhaps we should." "If you had your way, what?" the boy challenged, his small chin jutting out defiantly. "You'd what, lady? Ship us all off somewhere so you don't have to look at us? Pretend we don't exist?" Maggie stared down at this scrap of humanity who dared to challenge her, feeling something dangerous stirring in her chest. Anger, yes, but something else too. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. "I'd ensure that children like you were properly supervised, in institutions where you could learn discipline and useful trades instead of running wild like animals." The boy's eyes flashed with a fury that seemed far too mature for his years. "Animals? You think we're animals?" He took a step closer and Maggie caught a whiff of wood smoke and something else, soap. Despite his ragged appearance, someone had made sure he was clean. "Let me tell you something about animals, lady. Animals take care of their own. Animals don't abandon their cubs when times get hard." "How dare you?" "My pa used to say that the measure of a person wasn't how they treated folks who could help them, but how they treated folks who couldn't." The boy's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth. He said that kindness was the only thing that separated people from beasts. Something in his tone made Maggie pause. "Your father said that?" "Yeah. Before he died in your husband's mine." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her throat. "What did you say?" "My pa worked for Thomas Thornfield. Died in the cave-in 3 years ago, along with 6 other men. The boy's voice was steady now, matter-of-fact in the way that children learn to be when discussing tragedy. Pa always said Mr. Thornfield was a good man, that he cared about his workers. Guess that didn't extend to their families after they were gone. Maggie's world tilted on its axis. The cave-in. She remembered it vividly. 7 men killed when a support beam failed in the deepest shaft of the Thornfield silver mine. Thomas had been devastated, had personally attended every funeral, had set up a fund for the families. But that had been 3 years ago, and Thomas himself had died just 1 year later from a heart attack brought on by the stress and guilt. "What's your name?" she whispered. "Danny. Danny Morrison." Morrison. Maggie's knees nearly buckled. She remembered now, Patrick Morrison, one of the miners who'd died. A young man with a wife and small son. Thomas had spoken of him often in those final months, tormented by guilt over the accident that had claimed 7 lives. "Your mother. Died of fever last winter. Been on my own since then." Danny's voice remained steady, but Maggie could see the pain flickering in his eyes like candlelight in a storm. "But I ain't looking for charity, lady. I take care of myself." Maggie stared at this child, this orphan created by her family's business, left to survive on the streets while she lived in luxury on a ranch built with silver money. The irony was so sharp it cut like a blade. "Danny Morrison," she repeated, tasting the name like medicine. "You're Patrick Morrison's boy. You knew my pa?" "My husband spoke of him. Often." Maggie's voice was barely audible above the street noise. "He said your father was one of the best men he'd ever known." For the first time, Danny's composure cracked. His lower lip trembled, and he wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Pa always said good things about Mr. Thornfield too. Said he was fair, paid decent wages, cared about his workers like they were family." Family. The word hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. The Copper Creek saloon buzzed with the usual afternoon crowd of miners, cowboys and traveling salesmen, but Maggie barely noticed the noise as she sat in the corner booth, an untouched glass of whiskey before her. Across from her, Danny Morrison perched on the edge of his chair like a bird ready to take flight, his small hands wrapped around a glass of milk and a plate of beef stew that he was attacking with the focused intensity of someone who didn't know when his next meal might come. "Slow down," Maggie said softly. "No one's going to take it away from you." Danny paused, a spoonful of stew halfway to his mouth, and gave her a look that was equal parts suspicious and grateful. "Sorry? Ain't had a hot meal in a while." Maggie watched him eat and felt something crack open in her chest, a place that had been frozen solid since Thomas's death. This boy, this child of the streets, was connected to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Tell me about your father," she said. "What do you remember about him?" Danny's eyes lit up, transforming his thin face. "Pa was the strongest man in the world. Could lift me up with one hand and swing me around until I got dizzy. He used to tell me stories about Ireland where his pa came from. Said someday we'd go there together, see the green hills and the castles. He sounds like a good father. The best." Danny's voice grew quiet. "He worked real hard, saved every penny he could. Said he was gonna buy Ma a pretty dress and me a real horse someday. Said the mine was gonna make us rich enough to have our own little farm." Maggie's throat tightened. She remembered Thomas coming home from the mine, talking about the men who worked for him, their dreams and struggles. Patrick Morrison had been one of his favorites. Young, hard-working, devoted to his family. What happened after the accident? Danny's spoon clinked against the bowl as he set it down. "Mr. Thornfield came to the funeral. Gave Ma some money, said it was from a fund he'd set up. It helped for a while, but Ma, she never got over losing Pa, started getting sick all the time, couldn't work much. The money ran out and we had to move to a smaller place, then a smaller one after that. And when she died? The landlord threw me out. Said he wasn't running a charity for orphans." Danny's voice was matter-of-fact, but Maggie could see the hurt lurking beneath the surface. "Been living in the old mining shacks mostly, sometimes the church basement when Reverend Miller lets me." Maggie closed her eyes, seeing the chain of events that had led this child from a loving home to the streets. Her husband's mine, her husband's guilt, her husband's death. And through it all, she'd been so wrapped up in her own grief that she'd never thought about the family still struggling with the aftermath of that terrible day. "Danny, I need to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me. Have you been taking things? Stealing?" Danny's face flushed red. "I ain't no thief. I'm not accusing you. I'm just trying to understand how you've been surviving." "I work," Danny said proudly. "I sweep out the barber shop for Mr. Peterson, and I help load wagons at the freight office. Sometimes I run messages for folks. I earn my keep, lady." I don't take what ain't mine. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Maggie felt a stab of shame for her earlier assumptions. This child, this orphan created by her family's tragedy, had more integrity than most of the adults she knew. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I shouldn't have assumed. Danny studied her face with those two old eyes. You really knew my pa? Not personally, but my husband. Thomas spoke of him often, especially after the accident. He blamed himself, for what happened. It wasn't his fault. Pa always said mining was dangerous work, that every man who went down knew the risks. Said Mr. Thornfield did everything he could to keep them safe. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. Thomas never forgave himself. The guilt, it ate at him until his heart couldn't take it anymore. They sat in silence for a moment, two people bound together by tragedy and loss, by the ghosts of men who had cared about each other in life and whose deaths had left wounds that still hadn't healed. Mrs. Thornfield? Danny's voice was small, uncertain. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you help me today? Buy me food and all? You said street kids weren't your problem. Maggie looked at this remarkable child, this survivor who had maintained his dignity and integrity despite losing everything, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. Because I was wrong, she said simply. Because you're not just any street child. You're Patrick Morrison's son. And because... She paused, struggling with words that felt foreign on her tongue. Because maybe it's time I stopped hiding from the consequences of the life Thomas and I built. Danny tilted his head, confused. What do you mean? I mean that ranch, that money, that comfortable life I've been living, it all came from the mine. From the work that men like your father did, the risks they took. And when the worst happened, when those men died, I should have done more. I should have made sure their families were taken care of. But you said Mr. Thornfield set up a fund. Money that ran out. Help that ended when it was needed most. Maggie's voice was thick with guilt and regret. I've been so focused on my own grief, my own loss, that I forgot about the people who were still suffering because of that day. Danny reached across the table and touched her hand with his small, ink-stained fingers. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle, that Maggie nearly broke down completely. Pa used to say that grief makes people do strange things, makes them forget who they really are for a while. But he also said that good people always find their way back to themselves eventually. Maggie stared at this wise child who was offering her comfort instead of demanding justice, forgiveness instead of retribution. Your father raised a remarkable son. He tried to teach me right from wrong. Said it was the most important thing a man could pass on to his boy. Danny's voice grew stronger. And he taught me that family ain't just about blood. It's about people who care for each other, who look out for each other when times get hard. The word family hung between them again, but this time it felt less like a bridge and more like a promise. The Thornfield Ranch house sat like a jewel in the desert, its whitewashed adobe walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Maggie had built it with Thomas as a monument to their success, a testament to what two determined people could accomplish on the frontier. Now, as she led Danny up the front steps, she saw it through his eyes, vast, imposing, almost obscenely luxurious compared to the mining shacks where he'd been sleeping. Holy cow, Danny breathed, his eyes wide as he took in the carved wooden doors, the stained glass windows, the sprawling porches that wrapped around the entire structure. You live here all by yourself? I do. Maggie's voice carried a note of embarrassment she'd never felt before. It's larger than one person needs. Danny nodded solemnly. Pa always said rich folks built big houses to fill up the empty spaces in their hearts. The observation was so astute, so painfully accurate that Maggie stopped walking. Your father was a very wise man. He had his moments. Danny grinned, and for the first time, Maggie saw the mischievous boy hiding beneath the serious exterior. Ma used to say he was full of Irish wisdom and hot air in equal measure. Despite everything, Maggie found herself smiling. I think I would have liked your mother. She would have liked you too. Once she got past being mad about the fancy dress and all. Danny's grin widened. Ma had strong opinions about folks who put on airs. And what would she think about me bringing you here? Danny considered this seriously. She'd probably say you were trying to ease your conscience. But she'd also say that sometimes doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is better than not doing it at all. Maggie led him through the front door into the main hall, watching his reaction to the polished wood floors, the crystal chandelier, the oil paintings that lined the walls. Danny moved carefully as if afraid his presence might somehow damage the pristine perfection. You can touch things, Maggie said gently. You're not going to break anything. It's real fancy, Mrs. Thornfield. Fancier than anything I ever seen. It's just a house, Danny. Just walls and furniture and things that don't really matter much in the end. Rosa Martinez, the housekeeper who had worked for the Thornfields for 15 years, appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. Her dark eyes took in Danny's ragged appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had raised 6 children of her own. Senora Maggie? You bring home a guest. Rosa, this is Danny Morrison. Patrick Morrison's son. He'll be staying with us for a while. Rosa's expression softened immediately. She had been there the day Thomas came home from Patrick's funeral, had seen how the guilt had eaten away at him in the months that followed. I see. The little one who lost his papa in the mine. Rosa moved toward Danny with the natural warmth that had made her indispensable to the Thornfield household. You are hungry, Niño? You look like you could use some of Rosa's cooking. Danny glanced at Maggie uncertainly. I already ate in town, ma'am. Don't want to be a bother. No bother, Rosa declared, already heading toward the kitchen. Growing boys always have room for more food. Come, I show you where to wash up. As Rosa led Danny away, chattering in a mixture of English and Spanish, Maggie found herself alone in the vast hallway for the first time in years. The silence felt different somehow, less oppressive, more expectant. As if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She wandered into Thomas's study, a room she'd avoided since his death. His desk still held his papers, his books still lined the shelves, his pipe still rested in the ashtray where he'd left it that final morning. But now, instead of feeling like a shrine to the dead, it felt like a place where important decisions were made. Maggie pulled out the ledgers that detailed the mine's operations, the worker compensation fund, the payments made to families after the accident. The numbers told a story of good intentions and inadequate follow-through. Thomas had set aside money for the families, but he'd underestimated how long they would need support, how difficult it would be for widows and children to rebuild their lives. Mrs. Thornfield? Danny's voice came from the doorway. He'd been cleaned up and given one of Rosa's grandson's outgrown shirts, and the transformation was remarkable. Beneath the grime and rags had been hiding a handsome boy with intelligent eyes and his father's stubborn chin. You can call me Maggie if you'd like. Ma always said I should call grown-ups by their proper names. Shows respect. Your mother was right. But sometimes. Maggie paused, searching for the right words. Sometimes proper names can feel like walls between people. And I think we've had enough walls between us, don't you? Danny considered this gravely. I reckon that's true. But if I'm gonna call you Maggie, what should I call this place? Home? The question hit Maggie like a physical blow. Home. When had this house stopped feeling like home and started feeling like a mausoleum? When had she stopped living and started merely existing? I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like that very much. Danny moved into the study, his eyes drawn to the photographs on Thomas's desk. Is that him? Mr. Thornfield? Yes. That was taken on our wedding day 15 years ago. Danny studied the photograph intently. He looks like a good man. Kind eyes. He was. The best man I ever knew. Maggie's voice caught slightly. He would have liked you, Danny. He always said that children were the future, that everything we built was meaningless if we didn't pass it on to the next generation. Did you and Mr. Thornfield ever want kids of your own? The question was innocent, but it opened a wound that had never properly healed. We tried. For many years. But it wasn't meant to be. Danny nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children showed toward life's disappointments. Ma always said that sometimes God has different plans than what we think we want. Said maybe he knows something we don't. Your mother sounds like she was a very wise woman. She was. And she always said that family comes in all different shapes and sizes. Said love was what made people family, not just being born to the same folks. Maggie looked at this remarkable child who had somehow found his way into her life, into her home, into the frozen chambers of her heart. Danny, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay. How would you feel about staying here? Not just for a few days, but permanently. As my ward. My. She struggled with the word, afraid to voice it, afraid to hope. My son. Danny's eyes went wide. You mean it? You'd want me to stay. I mean it. If you'll have me. If you think you could be happy here. Danny was quiet for a long moment, and Maggie held her breath, waiting for his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I think Pa would like that. And I think Ma would too. They always wanted me to have a good home with people who cared about me. Then it settled. Maggie felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in 2 years, they were tears of joy rather than grief. Welcome home, Danny Morrison. As the boy launched himself into her arms, Maggie felt the last of the ice around her heart finally melt away. She had found her son, and he had found his mother, and somehow, in the midst of all the loss and pain, they had found their way to each other. 6 months later, the Thornfield Ranch buzzed with activity that would have been unimaginable when Maggie lived there alone. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the converted bunkhouse that now served as a school, where Danny and 7 other orphan children from Copper Creek spent their mornings learning reading, writing, and arithmetic from Miss Sarah Whitmore, the young teacher Maggie had hired from back east. Maggie stood on the front porch, watching Danny help the younger children with their horses in the corral. At 10 years old now, they'd celebrated his birthday with a party that had drawn half the town. He'd grown taller and stronger, but more importantly, he'd grown confident in his place in the world. The haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity and mischief of a boy who knew he was loved. "He's a natural leader," said Dr. James Whitmore, Sarah's older brother, as he joined Maggie on the porch. The young physician had come west to establish a practice and had stayed to court the woman who had transformed from the territory's most formidable widow into its most beloved benefactor. "He gets that from his father," Maggie replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "Patrick Morrison was the kind of man other men looked up to. And he gets his compassion from his adoptive mother." James moved closer, his hand finding hers. "Have I mentioned lately how remarkable you are, Margaret Thornfield?" Maggie felt the familiar flutter in her chest that James's presence always brought. She'd resisted his courtship at first, convinced that loving again would somehow betray Thomas's memory. But Danny, with the wisdom that seemed to come naturally to him, had pointed out that Thomas would want her to be happy, would want her to live fully rather than merely exist. "You're biased, Dr. Whitmore. Guilty as charged." James squeezed her hand gently. "But I'm also right. What you've built here, what you've done for these children, it's extraordinary." Maggie looked out at the ranch that had been transformed from a monument to wealth into something far more valuable. A home for children who had nowhere else to go, a school that prepared them for useful lives, a place where love mattered more than money. The Morrison Home for Children, as it was officially known, housed 12 orphans ranging in age from 6 to 16. They attended school in the mornings, learned practical skills in the afternoons, the boys working with the horses and cattle, the girls learning household management and basic nursing from Sarah, and spent their evenings as a family around the long table in the dining room that had once seemed impossibly large for just one person. "Maggie! Maggie!" Danny's voice called from the corral, bright with excitement. "Come see what little Pete can do." Maggie hurried down the steps, James following close behind. In the corral, 6-year-old Pete Kowalski, the son of a Polish miner who died in a cave-in just 3 months ago, sat proudly atop a gentle mare, his small hands gripping the reins with determination. "Look at me," Pete called out in his heavily accented English. "I'm cowboy now." "You certainly are," Maggie agreed, her heart swelling with pride. Pete had been nearly mute when he'd arrived, traumatized by his father's death and his mother's subsequent abandonment. But Danny had taken the younger boy under his wing, patiently teaching him English and helping him adjust to his new life. "Danny's been working with him every day," explained Maria Santos, one of the older girls who helped care for the younger children. "Says every boy should know how to ride." Maggie watched Danny guide Pete around the corral, offering encouragement and gentle corrections, and marveled at the transformation in both boys. Danny had found his purpose in helping others, while Pete had found his voice in the safety of belonging somewhere. "Mrs. Thornfield?" The voice belonged to Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had ridden up while she was distracted by Pete's writing lesson. "Sorry to interrupt, but I've got some news I thought you'd want to hear." "Of course, Sheriff. What is it?" "Got word from the territorial capital. The Morrison Home has been officially recognized by the territorial government as a legitimate educational institution. You'll be eligible for state funding to help with expenses." Maggie felt a surge of relief. The home was expensive to run, and while she had enough money to support it indefinitely, the official recognition meant that other communities might follow her example. "That's wonderful news, Sheriff. Thank you for riding out to tell me." "There's more." Bradley's weathered face creased into a smile. "The governor wants to visit next month. Seems word of what you're doing here has reached all the way to Washington. There's talk of using the Morrison Home as a model for other territories." As the sheriff rode away, Maggie felt James's arm slip around her waist. "Hear that? You're going to be famous, Margaret Thornfield." "We're going to be famous," she corrected. "This isn't something I could have done alone." "Speaking of we," James said, his voice taking on a nervous quality that made Maggie look at him sharply. "There's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." Before he could continue, Danny appeared at Maggie's elbow, his face flushed with excitement from the writing lesson. "Did you see Pete? He's getting real good." "I saw. You're an excellent teacher, Danny. Pa always said the best way to learn something was to teach it to someone else." Danny's expression grew thoughtful. "Maggie, can I ask you something?" "Always." "If Dr. Whitmore asked you to marry him, would you say yes?" Maggie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment while James choked on a laugh. "Danny Morrison, that's a very personal question." "I know. But I've been thinking about it a lot." Danny's voice grew serious. "See, I know you loved Mr. Thornfield something fierce. And I know you think maybe loving someone else would be like forgetting him or something. Danny. But I've been watching you and Dr. Whitmore together, and I can see how happy he makes you. And I think." Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think Pa would want me to have a real father, someone who'd stick around and teach me things and be there when I need him. And I think Mr. Thornfield would want you to have someone to love who could love you back." Maggie stared at this remarkable boy who had somehow become the wisest person she knew. "And what do you think about Dr. Whitmore?" "I think he's a good man. I think he loves you and he loves us kids, and I think he'd make a good father." Danny grinned suddenly. "Plus, Miss Sarah says if you marry her brother, she'll stay on as our teacher permanent like, and she's the best teacher in the whole territory." James laughed outright at that. "Well, I can't argue with that logic." "So?" Danny looked expectantly between the two adults. "Are you gonna ask her, Dr. Whitmore? 'Cause if you are, I think you should do it proper like, with a ring and everything." James reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Funny you should mention that, Danny. I was just working up the courage." Maggie's breath caught as James dropped to one knee right there in the dusty corral, surrounded by children and horses and the life they'd built together. "Margaret Thornfield," he said, his voice strong and clear, "you've shown me what it means to turn grief into purpose, loss into love. Will you marry me? Will you let me help you raise these remarkable children and build something beautiful together?" Maggie looked around at the faces surrounding her, Danny's hopeful expression, the other children gathering to watch, Sarah hurrying over from the schoolhouse with a delighted smile. This was her family, her real family, bound together not by blood but by choice, by love, by the shared commitment to healing and hope. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, James Whitmore, I'll marry you." As James slipped the ring onto her finger and the children erupted in cheers, Maggie felt Danny's small hand slip into hers. "I think Pa would be proud," he said quietly. "And I think Mr. Thornfield would be too." Maggie squeezed his hand, looking out at the ranch that had become so much more than she'd ever dreamed possible. "I think you're right, son. I think they'd both be very proud." In the distance, the mountains stood eternal against the Arizona sky, and somewhere in the wind that whispered through the cottonwoods, Maggie could almost hear the voices of the men who had brought them all together, Patrick Morrison and Thomas Thornfield, watching over the family that had grown from the seeds of their sacrifice. The Morrison Home for Children would continue to grow, would touch hundreds of lives in the years to come. But it had all started with one small boy who had the courage to speak his father's name to a woman who had forgotten how to love. Sometimes Maggie reflected as she watched her son, her remarkable, wise, brave son, teach another lost child how to find his way home. The most important discoveries came not from seeking treasure, but from opening your heart to the riches that were already there, waiting to be claimed.